This is a travesty. All we can hope is that this team keep losing and it brings change quickly. That's all we can hope.
And our offense.
We have reached the moment that changes everything. Not the moment where the tension reveals itself through body language you have to slow down and study frame by frame. Not the moment where you have to read between lines in a carefully worded post-game answer to understand what is really being said. This is the moment where it came out in the open, on live camera, in front of everyone watching, and it left no room for interpretation. What happened after the Indiana Fever's loss to the New York Liberty was not subtle. It was not diplomatic. It was Caitlin Clark on live television making it unmistakably clear that she heard what Stephanie White said at that podium, and she was not going to absorb it quietly and move on. The coach pointed at the wrong person. The wrong person pushed back. And the clip that followed,
for the most part, outside of the 23 free throw attempts in the fourth quarter, our defense gave us a chance.
She said we didn't move the ball much. Why you keep saying we? Why you keep saying we? It's only one person out there that was shooting every time they touched the damn ball. Monique Billings was balling today, came out there being a damn ball hog. And you talking about, oh, we got to find a way to free up Caitlin Clark. So your idea of freeing up Caitlin Clark is taking her off ball and running her around, which means the ball's probably going to end up in Kelsey Mitchell's hands, which means if Caitlin Clark get open, Kelsey Mitchell ain't passing it any goddamn way. That girl going to be done shot it. This is a travesty. All we can hope is that this
became the most viewed piece of Fever content this entire season because it captured in one unscripted moment everything that has been building inside this franchise for months. 3 minutes. That is the decision at the center of this story. Stephanie White pulled her franchise player 3 minutes into a stretch where she was the most dangerous offensive force on the floor, handed momentum back to the Liberty, watched the game unravel in exactly the way everyone watching could see coming, and then walked to that microphone after the final buzzer and pointed the camera in the wrong direction. That sequence, the pull, the collapse, the deflection at the podium, is what produced what we saw on live television. And what we saw on live television is what we are here to break down fully today. Before we get into the press conference and what Clark did in response, we need to walk through the game itself, because the context of what happened on the floor is essential to understanding why Clark's response was so pointed and why White's attempt to redirect the blame was so transparently dishonest. The Fever came out with energy in this one. Clark was doing what Clark does at her best. Reading the defense, moving the ball, pushing pace, creating the kind of offensive flow that this team needs when they are going up against elite opposition like the Liberty. There were stretches in the first half where Indiana looked like exactly the team they are capable of being when the people running the sideline are not actively working against the talent on the floor. And then, right on schedule, the coaching decisions intervened. Clark came off the floor during a stretch where she was the driving force of everything that was working offensively. The offense stalled immediately. The Liberty adjusted. The momentum the Fever had been building dissipated almost instantly, the way it always does when White makes the call to pull her franchise player at the worst possible moment. This is not a one-game observation. This is a pattern documented so consistently by this point in the season that Fever fans were calling it out on social media in real time while the game was still being played. Everyone watching could see what was happening. Everyone except apparently the people standing on the Fever sideline. Here is what made this specific game different from the usual Fever frustration. Kelsey Mitchell, a talented player with real offensive capabilities, spent critical stretches of the fourth quarter operating in isolation mode, ball in her hands, shot clock draining, the offense collapsing into one-on-one situations that the Liberty defense was perfectly equipped to handle. Contested pull-up jumpers in the clock's final seconds, drives into traffic when the pass was clearly available, decisions that shut down ball movement at the exact moments the Fever needed the ball to move most. White herself acknowledged it in the postgame. She said the team got a little tunnel vision. She just would not say whose tunnel vision it was or whose hands the ball was in during those sequences. This is not a condemnation of Kelsey Mitchell as an athlete. She is a professional competing in one of the most demanding environments in basketball. But when your coach stands at the postgame microphone and says we got impatient and we did not move the ball, and the most visible and measurable examples of both problems involve a specific player who is not Caitlin Clark. The choice to wrap that accountability in collective language is not accidental. It is a deliberate choice. A coaching decision made at the press conference podium rather than on the game floor. And the player being implicated by that choice knew exactly what was happening and what it meant. The post-game press conference is where this story ignited. Stephanie White said, "We got impatient. We did not move the ball at times." Collective language on the surface. But in the specific context of a Fever team where the primary ball handler and playmaker is Caitlin Clark, saying we did not move the ball does not land as a comment about the whole roster. It lands as a comment about one person. Everyone in that room understood who the coaching staff was looking at when they chose those words. White knew that. Every reporter in that room knew that. And most importantly, Caitlin Clark knew that. Here is the number that exposes the full picture of what this game actually was. 11 missed layups. 11. The highest percentage shots in basketball. The shots that professionals are expected to make consistently at this level, missed 11 times in a single game by the Indiana Fever. That is not a ball movement problem in the abstract. That is not an impatience problem in the abstract. That is a catastrophic offensive efficiency failure involving specific players missing specific shots they are paid at the professional level to convert. And those specific players are not Caitlin Clark. But White's post-game framing steered entirely around that concrete, measurable, countable failure, and pivoted to abstract concepts that could be attached to her franchise player without ever putting her name in the transcript. What White chose not to say is just as revealing as what she did say. No mention of the isolation possessions that stalled the offense in critical moments. No mention of the contested shot selection in the fourth quarter. No mention of the moments where ball movement collapsed because the ball was in one player's hands with no intention of going anywhere else. The contrast is stark. Vague collective blame framed in ways that clearly point at Clark. Silence around the specific, documented, countable decisions that actually cost Indiana the game. This is not balanced post-game analysis from a head coach trying to help her team improve. This is a narrative being constructed in real time at a podium, in front of cameras, designed to protect some players while implicating others. Now hear what Caitlin Clark heard when Stephanie White said those words. She was in that game. She knows who was holding the ball in the fourth quarter. She knows who was taking the contested shots with the clock running down. She knows that impatient is not an accurate description of her fourth quarter performance, and that the coaching staff has access to the same film she does and knows it too. She heard a coach assign blame using language carefully engineered to avoid specific accountability while making sure the implication landed on the right target. And what happened next is what every person watching live television saw play out in real time. Let us be precise about what Caitlin Clark actually did here, because the framing matters enormously. Describing this as her humiliating Stephanie White on live camera might suggest an eruption, a loss of composure, a moment where she said something she could not take back. That is not what happened. What happened was something more controlled, more deliberate, and ultimately more devastating than a visible explosion. Caitlin Clark has developed a very specific skill over the course of this turbulent season, the ability to communicate exactly what she thinks in a way that is technically defensible, but impossible to misunderstand. She has learned to say things that cannot be clipped out of context and characterized as unprofessional, but that leave anyone paying attention with zero uncertainty about what she means. After White's press conference, Clark's response operated in exactly this register. She did not say her coach was blaming her unfairly. She did not name Kelsey Mitchell. She did not say anything that could be fairly characterized as an attack on a teammate or coaching staff member. What she did was offer an account of the game. an account where the facts she described did not match the framing White had offered at that podium. She redirected. She reframed. She made it impossible for anyone watching both accounts side by side to not see the gap between them. That is not an explosion. That is a precision strike. And precision strikes do far more lasting damage. Before Clark said a single word, the cameras had already started telling part of the story. The body language captured between the final buzzer and Clark's own podium appearance was the body language of a player who had heard something she found unacceptable and was deciding in real time how to respond to it. Professional athletes develop enormous control over their public presentation in the scrutinized environment of postgame media. The fact that the broadcast was picking up something readable, something that communicated clearly without words, tells you how strong the feeling behind it was. She was not performing frustration for the cameras. She was containing it precisely enough to speak clearly, while not containing it so thoroughly that the truth became invisible. And everyone watching live understood exactly what they were seeing. We need to have the honest conversation about Kelsey Mitchell that the broader coverage of this story keeps avoiding, because she is central to what is happening inside the Indiana Fever in ways the coaching staff is clearly unwilling to address publicly. Mitchell is a talented basketball player. Her athleticism and scoring instincts are real assets. On the right team, with the right system, and the right coaching, she is a meaningful contributor. But here is the tension that has been visible all season. Mitchell's natural playing style, aggressive, possession-dominant, shot creation first, does not naturally complement what Caitlin Clark needs to operate at her ceiling. Clark needs the ball. She needs opportunities to read the defense and make decisions. She needs possessions that do not begin and end with another player's isolation attempt. When those two tendencies coexist in the same lineup without active coaching mediation, you get exactly what Indiana has been showing all season. Long stretches where possession usage crowds out Clark's effectiveness, followed by late-game collapses when the offense needs the playmaker it is supposed to have. The part that the players inside that locker room find impossible to accept is the double standard being applied. When Clark shows frustration, it becomes a story. When her body language communicates displeasure, it gets analyzed. When her post-game comments do not perfectly align with the coaching staff's preferred narrative, it gets characterized as a problem. The microscope on Clark is unrelenting. And Mitchell, the ball-dominant fourth-quarter decisions, the contested shots with the clock expiring, the tunnel vision White described without assigning a name, these receive public cover from the coaching staff. They are absorbed into collective language. They become team problems rather than specific, addressable issues with a specific origin. That double standard is visible to every player in the locker room. It is visible to every analyst who watches the film. And it was visible to Caitlin Clark in every word Stephanie White carefully chose at that post-game podium. The most plausible explanation for why this double standard exists involves organizational dynamics and coaching authority. Mitchell has been in Indiana longer. She has established relationships with the front office and coaching staff that predate Clark's arrival by years. And perhaps most importantly, Mitchell operates within the coaching staff system in ways that Clark, by virtue of her playmaking dominance, inevitably challenges. A ball-dominant player who does not require the offense to be restructured around her is paradoxically more compatible with a control-oriented coaching philosophy than a generational playmaker whose greatest value comes from operating outside rigid frameworks. White can manage Mitchell's role. She cannot fully manage Clark's impact. And coaches who prioritize system control over performance output will always be more comfortable with the player they can contain than the player they cannot. What happened after the Liberty game is the sharpest and most public moment in a season-long pattern. Game after game, the same structure has repeated itself. Clark builds offensive momentum early. The defense adjusts to her presence. The Fever start to find rhythm. And before that rhythm can establish itself, before the openings that Clark's gravity naturally creates can develop into something the team can sustain, White pulls her. The momentum evaporates. The team that was starting to click becomes the team starting from scratch. The opponent stabilizes. The Fever fall behind or fail to extend a lead they had built. And in the fourth quarter, when the game is on the line, the offense does not have the continuity or rhythm it would have built if the rotations had followed the game rather than a predetermined script. This pattern has a direct measurable impact on the Fever's performance. It is entirely within the coaching staff's control to fix. They have simply chosen not to. Somewhere above all of the people in this story is an ownership group watching its franchise investment underperform in real time. The television deals, the arena upgrades, the sponsorship infrastructure, all of it built on the assumption that the Indiana Fever are going to be a serious competitive organization worthy of everything that Caitlin Clark's arrival made possible. What ownership is watching instead is a coaching staff that manages its superstar through deflection and control rather than support and empowerment. A team visibly underperforming relative to its talent level because the people in charge cannot get out of their own way. The live confrontation after the Liberty game is the kind of moment that lands differently in an ownership meeting room than a locker room rumor. It is public. It is documented. It is on camera. It cannot be explained away. At some point, ownership has to look at the return on their investment and ask whether this leadership team is capable of delivering what they paid for. Every person has a threshold, a point beyond which continued patience stops being a virtue and starts being a failure to advocate for yourself. Caitlin Clark has shown remarkable patience with a situation that has been unfair to her from multiple directions simultaneously. The coaching dysfunction. The post-game scapegoating. The collective language engineered to implicate without naming. What we saw after the Liberty game suggests she has reached that threshold. Not the threshold of unprofessionalism. She stayed professional throughout. But the threshold of silence. The point where absorbing what is happening without pushing back is no longer something she is willing to do. Once a player crosses that threshold, the relationship with the organization changes. And more direct communication, from a franchise player to a head coach on live camera, is not a signal that everything is fine and sustainable. Nobody wants to say it plainly, so let us say it plainly. If the Indiana Fever do not make significant changes to how they are managing this situation, specifically to the coaching staff and the organizational culture that has developed around Clark, the possibility of a trade demand becomes real. Clark is under contract. She is not going anywhere tomorrow. But contracts end. Player options exist. And a generational talent who feels actively undermined by her own organization, who is being scapegoated for losses that the film does not support blaming her for, that player eventually starts thinking about her options. Fever ownership should be running that calculation every single day. Because losing Caitlin Clark to organizational dysfunction would not be a basketball story. It would be a catastrophe of historic proportions for a franchise that finally, for the first time in its history, has something genuinely special. Stephanie White stepped to that podium after the Liberty loss and used language that distributed blame in ways that clearly pointed at Caitlin Clark, while Kelsey Mitchell's decisions that actually cost Indiana in critical moments went entirely unaddressed. The deflection was transparent. The misdirection is documented. The film tells the real story. And the person being misdirected had finally had enough. That is not a subtle conclusion. That is not something you need to decode or interpret carefully. It is what happened on live television, and it is the most direct statement Caitlin Clark has made about the state of this franchise since the day she arrived in Indianapolis. The Indiana Fever are at a breaking point. The dysfunction is public. The scapegoating is on camera. The superstar has responded. And now the organization has a choice. The same choice they have been avoiding all season, but one they can no longer postpone. Fix it, or watch everything they have built around this player start to come apart in real time. The only question remaining is whether the right people make the right decisions before that becomes irreversible.